part 2 of our Chapter 1 podcast, we're going to be looking at how we describe resource use and conservation, how sustainability means environmental and social progress. We're also going to look at affluence and how this can be both a goal for a country as well as a liability. And we'll also talk about how Indigenous people can safeguard biodiversity.
So hopefully at this point you're starting to see that environmental science is very much about the natural world and then our role as humans in that natural world. Aldo Leopold was one of our greatest thinkers on conservation, and he observed that the greatest challenge in conservation has less to do with managing resources and more to do with managing people and what demands humans have on those resources. So this is kind of an interesting idea to keep in your mind, that in order to make changes with respect to how humans interact with the environment, we have to understand humans and what their needs are, and then what the limitations of the environment are in conjunction with those needs. Let's start by talking about how we use resources and how we describe resource use and conservation. So let's talk first about throughput. If we consider resource consumption, one important idea is throughput. It's the amount of resources that we use and we dispose of. Ecosystem services is referring to the services or resources that are provided by environmental systems. We do rely on these resources without thinking about them. And another idea to keep in the back of your mind, and we will revisit this idea throughout the semester, is the tragedy of the commons. And this refers to how population growth inevitably leads to the overuse and destruction of common resources. So there's this human desire to take and take and take and make sure that you have enough stuff, enough resources. But how do we manage people in a way that we aren't overusing or overexploiting those resources so that everyone has a chance to use those resources and benefit from those without destroying the resource? A lot of the ecosystem services that we depend on tend to be countless, and they're often invisible. So here's an example of ecosystem services in this image. We depend on photosynthesis, converting CO2 to oxygen. This is an example of provisioning or supporting services. Carbon capture, atmospheric regulation, temperature regulation, these are supporting and regulating services within an ecosystem. Decomposition, nutrient cycling, a lot of these things are things that you wouldn't necessarily think about, but it's a way for us to break down an ecosystem service into more specific needs within the ecosystem, and another way to talk about the resources that are provided by the ecosystem. All right, sustainability means environmental and social progress. So lately we hear a lot about sustainability in the news and the media. Sustainability for us is a search for long-term ecological stability as well as human progress. So naturally, neither ecological systems nor human institutions can continue forever. So the goal is to work to protect the best aspects of both realms and to encourage resiliency and adaptability in both of those. Sustainable development is defined as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So we have to think ahead with sustainable development. A lot of times we think about what the present needs are, and we develop based on what our present needs are without much consideration for the future. So thinking about how we can have less of a carbon imprint with buildings that we build, how we can decrease our energy usage. Those are the sort of things that are looking to the future and making sure that while we are meeting the needs of our current situation, we are thinking about future generations and not taking from them. Sustainability in terms of environmental and social progress is also affected by poverty. So if we're to fight poverty, we can help protect our shared environment. We're starting to realize that eliminating poverty and protecting our common environment are inextricably linked. The world's poorest people are not only the victims, but they're also the agents of environmental degradation. These people are forced to meet their short-term survival needs at the cost of long-term sustainability. Oftentimes we see people who are desperate for croplands in order just to feed themselves and their families may move into virgin forests, or they'll cultivate steep, very erosion-prone hillsides where your soils are depleted after only a few years. We see other people living in poverty move to cities and they'll live in crowded slums, ramshackle shanty towns. And in that situation, when you're crowded in, you have no way to dispose of waste. The residents of those shanty towns tend to foul their environment further by washing and drinking and essentially just surviving. And so children that are raised in these situations with very few economic opportunities are often condemned to perpetuate the cycle of poverty. So fighting poverty is going to help to prevent environmental degradation, and to promote sustainability. All right, our next idea under sustainability is affluence. And for us, affluence is gold. Everybody wants to have money and be rich, but it's also liability in terms of the environment. Taking the United States, for example, we have less than 5% of the world's total population, yet we consume a quarter of most commercially traded commodities such as oil. We produce a quarter to half of industrial waste such as greenhouse gases and pesticides and persistent pollutants that don't biodegrade in the environment. Americans together throw away 160 million tons of garbage each year. It's very consumeristic. As the rest of the world is seeking to achieve a similar standard of living, as your standard of living increases, there tends to be a higher consumption of conveniences and consumer goods. The question that we have to keep in the back of our mind is, what will be the effects on the planet? As everyone is trying to achieve the standard of living that we enjoy here in the U.S., what are the environmental impacts of that standard of living? In searching for environmental and social progress, we also have to ask ourselves, what is the state of poverty and wealth today? Countries with the highest per capita income, so we're talking about more than 40,000 US dollars per year, make up only 10% of the world's population. More than 70% of the world's population, we're talking about 5 billion people, live in countries where the average per capita income is less than 5,000, which is 1/10 of the US average. When you're living in poverty, the quality of life indicators tend to be low, and we're going to see a graph on the next slide about that. If you have an increase of poverty, you tend to have a decrease in access to health care. Therefore, illness is more common, lifespans tend to be shorter, infant mortality rates tend to be higher, you have lower access to education. We've talked about this when we talked about human population and what the effects of those are. So oftentimes where you have the poorest people, you tend to have families having the largest amount of kids, and you're going to tend to enter into that cycle of poverty. All right, we're looking at the per capita income in different regions. We are referring to US dollars in each of these so that we can compare between different countries. Notice North America is in blue. That's our top line. We see an increase in the average income. So we very rapidly increased income. And other countries, Europe, increased income. But what we're noticing is in our poorer countries, while they've had some increases in their income, we're seeing a bigger disparity or a bigger gap between our rich countries and our poor countries. So that is concerning and definitely something that we need to keep in mind as we think about the big picture in environmental science. In both rich and poor countries, Native and Indigenous peoples are generally the least powerful. They're sometimes the most neglected groups. Typically, they're descendants of the original inhabitants of an area that's been taken over by powerful outsiders. They're distinct from their country's dominant language, culture, religion, and racial communities. And we know that Indigenous people safeguard biodiversity. We're estimating there's about 500 million Indigenous people who remain in traditional homelands that still possess valuable ecological wisdom and remain the guardians of little disturbed habitats that are refuges for rare and endangered species and undamaged ecosystems. So just recently we are starting to recognize that some of the best ways to protect these lands are to recognize the native land rights and promote political pluralism. That way we can safeguard ecological processes and endangered species, and we want to give Indigenous title to extensive land areas because of that. So we've talked a lot about the state of population and poverty, and the next question, of course, is how do we know this? We have something called the Human Development Index, or an HDI, and this gives us data sources, provides us a large-scale view of issues such as hunger, poverty, education, or health across space and time. And looking at this, we can then compare countries to one another to figure out, are there data points like hunger and poverty, education, are there big discrepancies, or are these guys pretty much in line with one another?